My discussion today is going to be on Jawaharlal Nehru in today's context. What has happened to his vision? What lesson can we learn from Nehru in meeting our current challenges? Jawaharlal Nehru is demonized today. Lies, abuse are spread about him through the propaganda machinery of the ruling party. He is shown to be responsible for all evils that has come to this country, including the partition of the country. So much so that one BJP leader has quoted in an RSS mouthpiece actually said that Godse should have shot Nehru as he was the greater evil. It's interesting that not even the colonial masters of the communal parties of today, as you know, colonialism and communalism had a very close umbilical cord relationship. Colonialism used the communal parties of all variety, majority, minority, etc., to fight Indian nationalism. So even their masters, that is the British colonial state, did not abuse Nehru in this manner, despite the fact that for long 30 years, Nehru, from about 1915 onwards, till the independence, he fought against British rule. So much so that the British were forced to put him in their prison for 9 long years. A fact that the Nehru betas forget, that the person you are accusing spent 9 years of his prime life in jail and 30 years of his life fighting the British. We must ask ourselves the question that if Nehru was such an evil person, why did Gandhiji, the father of the nation, specifically choose Nehru to be his successor and not one of the other tall stalwarts like people like Sardar Patel or C. Rajagopalachari? In a speech on 25th January 1942, as early as 1942, Gandhiji declared, "Someone suggested that Jawaharlal Nehru and I are estranged. This is baseless." In his typical manner of using appropriate idioms, he says, "You cannot divide water by repeatedly striking it with a stick." It's so appropriate a description of what is being attempted today by the communal parties in attacking leaders of the national movement and seeking differences within them all the time. Gandhi, Nehru, Nehru, Patel, Nehru, Subhash Chandra Bose, Bhagat Singh, Gandhi, Gandhi, Bose, as if the Indian national movement was all about not fighting the British but each other. That is the picture that is presented, and Gandhiji is making fun of it. He says that you may go on striking with a stick, but you cannot divide water. He says it is difficult to divide us. I have always said that not Rajaji, not Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, but Jawaharlal will be my successor. When I am gone, Gandhiji says, he will speak my language too. And listen to this last part. He says, even if this does not happen, I would at least die with this faith. So Gandhiji is not willing to give up this faith. He would rather die with the faith that Jawaharlal would be the person who would take his message forward. Now, why was this? Why did Gandhiji have such faith in Jawaharlal Nehru? Why did he choose him as successor? As historians, this has worried us, There were so many stalwarts in our national movement, but what was it about Jawaharlal Nehru that makes Gandhiji choose him? In my understanding, it is because Nehru, for two reasons. Firstly, because Nehru quintessentially represented what Rabindranath Tagore called the idea of India. That is, the vision of the freedom struggle. And Nehru was the only one among the tall leaders who represented all aspects of that vision of the idea of India. He was not good at only one of them, but each one of them was very close to him and he fought for them very hard. Now, what is this vision? Very quickly, this vision has 4 or 5 critical elements. The vision of our freedom struggle, 100-year-long freedom struggle, had 4 or 5 critical elements. The first was, of course, self-reliance, independence, or sovereignty. Naturally, it was anti-imperialist, so sovereignty and independence was number 1. 2 was democracy. 3 was secularism. And these two were not separated. In fact, in the colonial period, if you will find, often these two terms are used coterminously, secular democracy. Because you cannot be democratic if you are not secular, and if you cannot be secular if you are not democratic. So these are two very important parts. The fourth thing was a pro-poor orientation. This was the vision. Whether you were a Dadabhai Naoroji, an early nationalist moderate, or whether you were Gandhi, or whether you were Acharya Narendra Dev, a socialist, or whether you were a communist, this was common, that India must have a, future India must have a pro-poor, pro-people orientation. And the last was, in which of course Nehru emphasized this the most, that we must have a modern outlook, a scientific temper as he called it. We must go beyond obscurantism and blind faith. These are the vision. And now each one of them Nehru struggled for and held very close to his heart, as I will show you very soon. And each one of them is under threat today. Independence, democracy, secularism, pro-poorness, and scientific temper, all of them are under threat today. That is why remembering Nehru and seeing what he did, what he did to implement the idea of India, that is the second reason why Gandhiji chose him. Gandhiji felt that Nehru would be the best person to implement the vision of the national movement in the future. So if we study, and I will try to highlight to you how he tries to implement these ideas, I think we can learn a lot of lessons about today, because each one of these vision, as I said, is under attack. I will outline his role in all of these in a moment. The biggest challenge to the idea of India, or the dreams of our freedom struggle leaders, freedom fighters, came at the point of the birth of the state itself, at independence itself. Between 1946 and 48, India faced what is called a Holocaust-like situation. Beginning with the Calcutta killings in 1946, followed by the Noakhali killings in same year, and then in retaliation the Bihar killings, and then the partition of the country, in which 5 lakh people died and about 60 lakh people were made homeless, one of the biggest transfers of population, forced transfer of population in such a short time. So this was a period when the feelings of the people, the communal temperature had reached a peak. Today we think that we are in a very grave danger, but compare the situation today to what it was in 46 to 48, and you will realize that it was not, that was much, much more difficult. And on top of this, the Mahatma is murdered by Godse, who had close links, as we all know, with the Hindu Mahasabha, the RSS, and Savarkar. What lesson can we learn from this situation? How did our nationalist leadership react to this situation? And particularly Nehru, because after Gandhi's assassination, the whole burden, a very large part of the burden of keeping the vision alive fell on Nehru. Gandhi, as we know, spent 4 months in Noakhali, walking the villages of Noakhali, where massive killings were occurring, again with Muslim League support. It was happening. And he was there between November 1946 and March 1947. That is the period when the transfer of power is being negotiated. One of the biggest events in world history of the 20th century. Because after India gets independence, the empire of the traditional type just collapses all over the world. So it was a very big event. And the top leader of that event, of that movement, is nowhere available. Other leaders went up to Gandhiji and said, Gandhiji, when will you come back? We are in the process of negotiating a transfer of power. How long will you stay in Noakhali? He said, I will stay as long as it takes. And he said, what use is this freedom if the soul of the country is destroyed? to Gandhiji, the soul of the country was Hindu-Muslim unity. One of the first things he insisted on when he came back to India and reorganized the Congress was that a believer, a person who joins this party must believe in Hindu-Muslim unity. While Gandhiji is at Noakhali, when the retaliatory killings happen of Muslims in Bihar on a massive scale, it spread to the villages. What was Nehru's response? He was at that time heading the interim government as Prime Minister, 46. He took his entire cabinet, virtually his entire cabinet. He took Rajendra Prasad, Sardar Patel, Maulana Azad, Jayaprakash Narayan, Acharya Kripalani, just name them. He took them all to Bihar and he said, we are not going to move here till we stop this rioting. Lesson to be learned over there. And the riots did stop in a very short time. And moment he arrived there in November 46, he says, I will stand in the way of Hindu-Muslim riots. Members of both communities will have to tread over my dead body before they can strike at each other. So he made it very clear what his intentions were. What a contrast to this today. 40 kilometers from Delhi, Dadri happens. A person is lynched simply on the suspicion of his having some kind of meat in his fridge. And I mean, I do not need to repeat the examples. I started with that. But then Muzaffarnagar has happened, and then similar lynchings have happened all over the country. And where is our leadership? Lesson to be learned from much worse killings, much larger communalization that did exist. But then we had a leadership which had the courage to come up front and said that this is not on. More important, Nehru saw Gandhiji's assassination as an attempt to change the nature of the Indian state. It is very important to see this. He said it's not just one madman killing Gandhiji. He says it was an organized attempt. He wrote a letter to the chief ministers on 5th February 1948, soon after Gandhiji's assassination. He says a deliberate coup d'etat was planned involving killings of several persons and the promotion of a general disorder to enable the organization, he means the RSS, to seize power. So there was an attempt now to change the nature of the state, because independence comes as a result of a movement which is a secular movement. So what we will have is a secular state at the end of it. But because of the Holocaust-like situation, the rise in communal temperatures, the murders and the killings, they thought here was an opportunity. If we exacerbate this situation, here is an opportunity to capture power and make India into the mirror image of Pakistan. Muslim Pakistan, Hindu India. This was a threat to the very idea of India, to the very dreams of our freedom fighters. And Nehru was not going to let this happen. With Patel as his deputy prime minister and home minister, and with his full support, 25,000 RSS people are put in jail. It takes courage. And they ban the RSS. More important than that, he of course believed in democracy, so he let them go after a while. But more important is that he converted the first general election into a referendum. The referendum was the question, one single question, on what kind of Indian state do we want? Do we want a secular India, or do we want the mirror image of Pakistan? Do we want a Hindu India like in Muslim Pakistan? And he traveled 40,000 kilometers. And mind you, he didn't have this 8,000 crore plane that our recent leaders have acquired. He talked to about 35 million people. That is 1 out of 10 people he addressed as I am addressing you. And the results were dramatic. In a peaceful, we should be proud of this, that in a peaceful election, within 2 years of the Holocaust and the murder of Mahatma Gandhi, we have a peaceful election, and the communal parties, Hindu Mahasabha, Jan Sangh, Ram Rajya Parishad, all put together, got only 10 seats out of 489. They got only 6% of the votes. Communalism had been pushed to the corner. Stunning achievement by any standards. Unfortunately, never since then has the issue of secular, inclusive India been forefronted in this manner. Till today, when clearly we can see that one of the biggest threats that our country faces today is the divisive politics that is being promoted by political parties. This is a big lesson to be learned from here. Another lesson, related lesson to be learned, which Nehru repeatedly warned people. Again, these are all available in the letters to the Chief Minister. He says, if fascism ever came to India, it will take the form of majority communalism. And therefore, that is the reason, since he was a Democrat, that he saw the threat of communalism as such an important threat, because it would bring fascism as it is tending to do in our unfortunate country today. The second lesson to be learned from Nehru's experience is on the issue of democracy. India faces a situation today where the world is no longer accepting us as a full democracy. Our ranking in the democracy index has fallen to 53. We are now described as a flawed democracy. An institution, Sweden-based institution called the VDEM Institute, very renowned institution, in March 2021 called India, no longer the democracy word doesn't even figure in describing in India, called India an electoral autocracy. This downgrading of India as an example to the whole world that a poor post-colonial country can be democratic. This downgrading from that into electoral autocracy was based on, they state the reasons. Why has India been downgraded? The reasons given are the government promoting anti-minority, that is anti-Muslim feelings and strife, the decrease in civil liberties and human rights, and I'm quoting, the diminishing freedom of expression of the media, of civil society have gone the furthest during Narendra Modi's rule. That is why the downgrading has happened. What can we learn from Nehru in this context? For Nehru, democracy and civil liberties were non-negotiable. As he said, I would not give up the democratic system for anything. Whatever his personal beliefs were, he said, I would not give the democratic system for pushing any idea that I may have. He said, if civil liberties are suppressed, a nation loses all vitality. He was in fact the founder of the Indian Civil Liberties Union as early as 1936. He also said, what does civil liberties, free press means? Free press, he says, doesn't mean that you allow the press to print things that you like. He says free press means allowing the severest criticism of oneself. And as we know, and there is enough proof of that he not only allowed, he even promoted criticism of himself and his policies. For him, democracy meant respecting and even encouraging opposition. Look at his first cabinet. There were people who were completely opposed to his worldview. Shama Prasad Mukherjee is included in the cabinet. Ambedkar is included in the cabinet, and as you know, Ambedkar had nothing to do with the Indian National Congress. John Mathai of the Tatas is included in the cabinet, and Nehru was a socialist. C.D. Deshmukh, a former ICS officer, was included in the cabinet. He said in 1950, at the peak of his popularity, he is not including people simply because he has to, that you have to form a coalition because he is so weak. He is doing it when he is at the strongest. At the peak of his popularity, immediately after independence at 1950, he says, I am not afraid of the opposition in this country. I do not want India to be a country in which millions of people say yes to one man. I want a strong opposition. Prophetic words. At another point, he says, again warning against our current situation, this is too large a country with too many legitimate diversities to permit any so-called strong man to trample over people and their ideas. And we are seeing the impact of this strong man emerging. His contribution in building the institutions of democracy, again big lessons out there, is legendary. His respect for the parliament, for example. Even when he was ill and aged, he would insist on attending the parliament, sit through long hours of the parliament. He would encourage his opponents. The legendary comments he made about Vajpayee is now talked about. Vajpayee, who was Atal Bihari Vajpayee, who was a big critic of Nehru, he encouraged him and he praised his ability to critique. Similarly, other institutions like the cabinet system, if you read C.D. Deshmukh's autobiography, he specifically says that Nehru would insist that cabinet members take decisions on their own and do not just rubber stamp his views. The press, the cartoonists, Lakshman's cartoons of Nehru are legendary. He would encourage people to critique him. The independence of the judiciary, and for me, an academic, his vision of universities as a critical element in a democracy are to be remembered. As he said, Nehru said, a university stands for humanism, for tolerance, for reason, for the adventure of ideas, and the search for truth. If the universities discharge their duties adequately, then it is well with the nation and the people. And what are we doing to our universities? We are silencing our universities through brutal attacks, police lathi charges, arrests of students, intimidating of faculty, messing with curricula, dictating curricula to universities, political dictation. Where is the adventure of free ideas? Where is the chance of a survival of democracy? Coming to the question of sovereignty and independence, his emphasis on self-reliance must be remembered. Just translating self-reliance into Atmanirbharta, just translating Nehru calling himself the first servant of the country into Pradhan Sevak, doesn't make you either Atmanirbhar or Pradhan Sevak. What was the content that Nehru put into these ideas? At independence, Nehru was very clear that political independence is no use unless you have economic independence. He saw our situation at independence as what is described by academics as a neo-colonial situation. At independence, to make any investment, and you cannot grow unless you make investment, that is, to make any growth in India, the entire machinery had to be imported from the very countries from whom we got independence. The advanced countries from Britain. 95% of even machine tools, your pliers and wrenches, had to be imported at independence. And Nehru saw that this dependence on the advanced world is not going to allow us to be really independent. So Nehru brilliantly, through planning and the famous Nehru Mahalanobis strategy and the extensive use of the public sector, which the current regime is all set to destroy. The public sector with the HMT, the BHEL, the Bharat Earth Movers, etc., it became the hardcore of the Indian economy, the temples of modern India, as he called it. He was able to change this situation. I'll give you one statistic and be done with it. At independence, if nearly 100% of the machinery had to be imported, by 1960, within 13 years, only 43% had to be imported. And by 1970, only 9% had to be imported. That is, 91% of our own growth we could manage on the basis of the machinery that India was producing. This was Jawaharlal Nehru. This was the unstructuring of the colonial structure. This is what made India into a truly independent country with an independent foreign policy. This is what enabled India to lead nearly 100 countries in the non-aligned movement. This is what allowed India not to become a stooge of either of the two superpowers at a time when the great power rivalry was legendary. Much to be learned from this. Independence does not come just by hugging world leaders and sitting on a jhula with them. It takes a lot of hard work. Nehru was also aware that independence also meant food security and a thriving agriculture. Here again, I would like to nail another lie about Nehru, which is said that Nehru ignored agriculture. He built industry, yes, but he ignored agriculture. This is a complete lie. In the first 3 plans, agriculture in India grew 8 times faster than the previous 50 years. Nehru set the stage for the Green Revolution. The Intensive Agricultural District Program, which is what the Green Revolution was launched in Nehru's time. The land reforms, the tractors, the diesel engines, the dams, the electricity were all necessary for the Green Revolution, and he had laid the stage for it. I'll just end by quoting the best agricultural expert of that period, Daniel Thorner. He said, it is said that this initial 5-year plans neglected agriculture. This charge cannot be taken seriously. The facts are, in India's first 21 years of independence, more has been done to foster change in agriculture, and more change has actually occurred than in the preceding 200 years. That is, in 15 years what has been achieved. Lastly, one of the very important aspects of Nehru was that Nehru realized that true sovereignty can come only if India is self-reliant in science and technology, an area which was deliberately kept barren by the colonial rulers. If you look at the first plan, the 1950s is not only about building the dams and the steel mills and this and that. It is equally, as importantly, about building the IITs, the National Physical Laboratory, the National Chemical Laboratory, the Bhabha Atomic Research Center, the All India Institute of Medical. All the major institutions that you can think of are designed at that time. Nehru was anticipating the knowledge revolution brilliantly. It is because of this anticipation that today India is in a position to participate in the information revolution. As you are aware, the service sector today is the leading sector in the Indian economy. It is what powers India's growth. Nearly half our GDP is produced in the service sector, and the service sector is based on the knowledge economy. We have now begun to undo the great achievements of our scientific establishments. So much so that lakhs of Indian students now have to migrate abroad to get a quality higher education. When we grew up, lakhs of students used to come from all over the world to get a quality scientific education in India. It's on the reverse that we have gone. What is being done to the scientific temper today has made us a laughingstock of the world. Normally doesn't require repetition, but I must, because such a laughingstock has been made of us. In speeches in front of doctors, in speeches inaugurating scientific conferences, in inaugurating scientific exhibitions, technical engineering exhibitions, our political leaders, I'll name them if you wish, tell young scientists fantasies. They tell them about plastic surgery in ancient India. Otherwise, how did Ganesh get his head? The governor of Bengal tells you that Arjun of the Mahabharata had actually nuclear-tipped arrows. You are now told that Corona can be got rid of through gobar, through gomuth, through thali, through tali, through Ganga Snan, through unverified medicines produced by a favorite yogi, etc. It is nothing but state-sponsored travesty of the scientific temper. Lastly, for Nehru, the poor remained at the center of his imagination. He never lost track of this vision of the idea of India, the necessity of keeping the poor in the picture, a pro-poor orientation. He says, as early as 1952, if poverty and low standards continue, then democracy ceases to be a liberating force. It must therefore aim continuously at the eradication of poverty. In other words, and this is very sharply put, in other words, political democracy is not enough. It must develop into economic democracy also. And Nehru took giant steps in that direction towards an economic democracy. The land reforms, one of the most difficult things to do. 200-year-long tradition of landlordism was dismantled in Nehru's time within about a decade, and that too with democracy, unparalleled in the world. No General MacArthur's army to do it for you. No massacres of people, of kulaks or landlords. And yet the zamindari system was broken. The land reforms, the community development program that he launched, the use of the public sector, the empowering of the working class and their rights. If you look at the trade union movement, you will see a sharp increase after independence. And it was allowed and encouraged. The popularizing of the socialist ideal, which Nehru did, like nobody else, were all done in his time. The stark contrast today is visible to the whole world, where we see floating bodies of the poor in the Ganga. We witness scenes of thousands of abandoned migrant workers walking with their children, their old and their ill, thousands of miles in scorching heat. These images have shaken the conscience of the whole world. We have left our poor aside. I would like to conclude by saying that Nehru's fantastic effort to raise India from what Rabindranath Tagore called the mud and filth left behind by the British, that task, that fantastic effort has now been replaced with the Indian state pushing India back into that mud and filth of ignorance, of obscurantism, of disempowerment, of unfreedom, and most of all, of communal hatred. Why it is so important to remember Nehru, why he is relevant today? Because we are seeing the entire fabric that was so in such an imaginative manner woven in this country of the Indian people, it is being destroyed. We are seeing the vision of which we were proud at one time, that here is a country which is an example in the world where people as diverse as nowhere else, how they could live together for centuries, that is at stake. We are witnessing a situation where we were proud to demonstrate to the whole world. In fact, in the 1950s and 60s, political scientists globally had said that India can never succeed as a democracy. The only way that third world countries can grow is through autocratic or through military dictatorships and things like that. We were able to demonstrate that this was possible. We went around the world with our heads high. When Nehru refused to follow the American line on Vietnam, on Korea, on this, that and the other, and advise the whole world on what their foreign policy should be, many people would say that you are so poor, you can hardly feed yourself. Who are you to lecture to us? So Nehru's answer at that time was, we may be poor, but who has told you the poor cannot have a voice? It is the whole legacy of our national movement, the description of the Indian nation. Our nationalism was equated to the people. It is not equated to a region. It is our people. And this commitment to our people, irrespective of their wealth or their caste or their language or the region or whatever, that is what was our greatest achievement. And that is being torn apart. And that is why it is so important to remember Nehru and to see that how he concretely tried to meet each of these challenges: economic, political, social. Nehru is very, very relevant in today's context.